Come round by my side, I'll sing you a song. I'll sing it so soft it'll do no one wrong. On Bermingham Sunday the blood ran like wine, and the choir kept singing of freedom. That cold autumn morning a cloud hid the sun, and Addie May Collins, her number was 1. In the old Baptist church there was nowhere to run, and the choir kept singing of freedom. The sky, it was grey, the autumn wind blew, and Denny's McNair brought the number to 2. The falcon of death was a creature they knew, and the choir kept singing of freedom. The church, it was crowded, and no one could see that Cynthia Wesley's dark number was 3. Her prayers and her feelings would shame you and me, and the choir kept singing of freedom. Then young Carol Robertson entered the door, and the number her killers had given was 4. She asked for a blessing and asked for no more, and the choir kept singing of freedom. On Bermingham Sunday a noise shook the ground, and people all over the earth turned around, for no one recalled a more cowardly sound, and the choir kept singing of freedom. This Sunday has come, this Sunday has gone, and I can't do much more than to sing you my song. I'll sing it so soft it'll do no one wrong, as the choirs keep singing of freedom, as the choirs keep singing of freedom.
Good morning. My name is Bill Hevlin, and I have the pleasure of being your worship associate today. Welcome, everyone. If you are here for the first time, if you're curious about our faith, welcome. If you've been here before, or if you're a long-time member, welcome back. Good to see you today. All are welcome, whether you believe in God or a higher source, hold to humanist or secular teachings, if you come from another religion, or if you've always been Unitarian Universalist, you are welcome here. The UU Coastside community welcomes people of all skin tones, the LGBTQ plus community, kids and mature folks, those with life challenges, and those temporarily without such challenges. For here, we are working to overcome our society's systemic biases, and you specifically are most welcome. Today, Clovice Lewis Jr. returns to speak about how Martin and Malcolm were both right. People often tend to compare Martin Luther King's approach toward the civil rights movement in the United States with Malcolm X's approach. Some feel our country dodged a bullet by taking King's nonviolent path. Many of us are aware that both men expressed very nuanced opinions that contradicted the public perceptions of their positions. This recorded sermon examines how those nuances speak powerfully to the historical confluences that shape our racial challenges to this day. After the service today, I hope you stay on Zoom to join us in our usual random, smallish breakout groups that give us a chance to discuss thoughts from today's service. To that end, we'll post some prompts in the chat, or we can just say hi to each other and reminisce about the bygone days of 2020. Announcements. We want to thank UU San Mateo for administrative and professional support, and in particular to the Reverend Ben Myers, a consistent source of valuable guidance for us. For financial donations to UUCC, we have options for both online and by check. For detailed instructions, see today's order of service or in the email announcing this service. Join us on February 7th as Reverend Ranwa Hamami, President of the Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry of California, talks on the February Touchstones topic of mercy in a sermon titled, A Gentle, Angry People. The concept of mercy can have different expressions based on this context. So how do we express mercy in our own way? How do we experience and show mercy as Unitarian Universalists, people of faith, and co-creators of justice? And now, Shauna will introduce our opening hymn.
When Harriet Tubman brought other enslaved people with her on foot to freedom on that arduous, dangerous journey they called the Underground Railway, she used this song to tell them when they should quickly get into the river so that the dogs that the trackers were using to hunt them would lose their scent. When we sing this song today, we're saying to each other, let's do something for peace and justice. Let's speak up about what we see. Let's get our feet wet. As the late Congressman John Lewis used to say, when you see something that's not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble, as Unitarian Universalists have been doing for centuries, getting in good trouble. For us, here, now, that's what this hymn is about. Please rise in body and or spirit and join us in singing hymn number 210, Wade in the Water, Children, God's Gonna Trouble the Water.
God's gonna trouble the water. See
And now, Dave, if you would lead us in the lighting of the chalice.
Good morning. The match moves to light the flame of social justice. Now, please join us in reading these chalice words, lighting words from Erica Hewitt, until all means all. The chalice, as a symbol of Unitarian Universalism, arose as a beacon of hope in an atmosphere of tyranny. The chalice arose as a sign of promise that the marginalized would neither be forgotten nor ignored, because they are beloved and precious from the perspective of the holy. This morning, we remember all of the people who have been told explicitly or implicitly, through police violence or government policy, through derision or dehumanization, that they are anything less than whole, anything less than beloved. As we each light a chalice in our homes, may we make our lives a beacon, a symbol of our promise to draw the circle wide, a sign that we will not rest until all means all. Now, Shauna will lead us in sharing our joys and concerns.
One of the ways that we create our beloved community is by sharing our own joys and concerns with one another and finding support from each other. So now go ahead and click the chat button at the bottom middle of your Zoom window if you have a joy or a concern to share. You can just type them in that window. And as you do so, I'll offer my improvisation on Precious Lord, Take My Hand, which the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said was his favorite hymn. We acknowledge the continuing anguish with this pandemic, and we extend our gratitude to all essential workers who are so stressed at this time. May they be safe and healthy. And we all look forward to immunity to COVID-19 and to our vaccinations, if they are possible for us medically. We're so grateful that that vaccination is becoming available to everybody. We've seen with horror and sadness the unprecedented insurrections around our country by an angry minority. We hope for a safe and sane transfer of power in this coming week, and we hope for constructive dialogue between the sides at every level of governance and down through our communities. That's a lot of work we have to do. We believe, though, and we affirm that democracy, a very Unitarian Universalist value and idea, can survive and thrive. All of our concerns and our joys that we've expressed publicly and all that remain in the depths of our hearts, we hold them up together to the light. May we hold with love and care everything that has been shared. In these times of reflection and renewal, let us remember that it remains important to reach out to one another when we feel the need and to accept being reached out to. May we find comfort in knowing that we can share our joys and our concerns here among us. And now, please join me in breathing and in singing the hymn, Meditation on Breathing.
Now, with great pleasure, I introduce our worship leader today, Clovice Lewis Jr. Clovice is a professional cellist and composer. He wrote his first symphony at age 17 and was a professor of computer music at UC Santa Barbara from 1978 to 1986. He has also been a serial entrepreneur and software designer for the last 30 years. In addition to music and technology, he has had a lifelong passion for aviation and has been a private pilot since 1987. Clovice is just 3 credits from receiving his Master's of Divinity from Star King to become a UU minister. His ministry emphasizes breaking down racial, class, and ethnic barriers and preaching the gospel of the madness of human self-extinction. Now, let's listen to Clovice, who has kindly recorded this sermon just for us.
He was born in 1921 as the 4th of 7 children. His parents were admirers of Marcus Garvey His father was an outspoken Baptist lay speaker, and both of his parents were leaders in the Universal Negro Improvement Association. 4 of his uncles were killed by white violence. His parents moved several times because of KKK threats against their family. They were harassed by a white racist group called the Black Legion because of his parents' political activities. His father was rumored to have been killed by that group. His mother was then committed to a mental hospital, and he and his siblings were separated and placed into foster homes. He left high school in 1941 before graduating, after a white teacher told him that practicing law was no realistic goal for a nigger. In 1943, he moved to Harlem and engaged in petty crime. While there, he befriended a man who would later be known as the famous comedian we now call Red Fox. He was declared mentally unstable for military service because he told the draft board during early World War II, "I want to be sent down south, organize some nigger soldiers, steal some guns, and kill us some crackers." He began serving an 8 to 10 year sentence for larceny and breaking and entering in 1946. While in prison, he embarked on a program to educate himself and developed an appetite for reading everything he could get his hands on. His name was Malcolm Little. In 1950, he began signing his name as Malcolm X, after becoming a member of the Nation of Islam while in prison. In 1957, the American public first became aware of Malcolm X as a spokesman for the Nation of Islam after Hinton Johnson, a Nation of Islam member, was beaten by 2 New York City police officers. Now, you must already know the fabled story of Martin Luther King Jr., who was 7 years younger than Malcolm X and was born into a family of Baptist ministers. But what is not commonly known is how bitter he was against white people because of the daily humiliation black people endured in the segregated South. During his adolescence, King became skeptical of the most fundamental claims of Christianity, such as the bodily resurrection of Jesus and literalist Bible teachings. In his junior year of high school, in 1944, he won an oratorical contest sponsored by the Elks Club in Dublin, Georgia. In that speech, King stated, quote, "Black America still wears chains. The finest Negro is at the mercy of the meanest white man. Even winners of our highest honors face the class color bar." King's feud with Christianity subsided after his junior year in Morehouse College. It was then that he concluded the church offered an answer to his inner urge to serve humanity. His ambition was to be a rational minister, with sermons that were, quote, "a respectful force of ideas, even social protest," end quote. He received his PhD degree in systemic theology on June 5th, 1955, and by 1957, King had joined with other civil rights activists to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and became immersed in the attempt to force civil rights reform by using the moral authority and power of black churches along with nonviolent protest. I was born in 1956, right about the time that both King and X were becoming well known for their civil rights activities. When X was assassinated, I was 9 years old, and I was nearly 12 when King was assassinated. I was a news hound from the earliest time I could remember. Indeed, I could tell you at 5 years old all about the submerged dive under the North Pole the USS Nautilus completed 3 years before. Even at a very young age, I knew that I could not accept the kind of degradation and humiliation my parents had to endure as African Americans in this country. that was going to stop with me, one way or another. As I grew older, I became aware that I was part of a generation that carried the messages of both men simultaneously. King saying, turn the other cheek when struck, and X saying, anytime you tell a man to turn the other cheek or to be nonviolent in the face of a violent enemy, you're making that man defenseless. You're robbing him of his God-given right to defend himself. That was the psychic tension that has existed within me my entire life. It was also the tension the United States lived in during the tumultuous years of the Civil Rights era. People often tend to compare Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach during the Civil Rights movement in the United States with Malcolm X's approach, and some feel our country dodged a bullet by taking King's nonviolent path. They erroneously believe we reached some measure of social balance and were somehow saved from the Malcolm X's scarier path. We did not achieve any balance. What we achieved was hysteresis, which is a term I borrow from science to describe any system in whose response depends not only on its current state, but also upon its past history. It means that when you push on something, it will yield. But when you release the force applied, it does not spring back completely. I speak, of course, of the history that produced both remarkable men. I could include other great civil rights luminaries, such as James Baldwin, Eldridge Cleaver, Maya Angelou, Rosa Parks, Barbara Jordan, Medgar Evans, Paul Robeson, Percy Julian, John Lewis, Stokely Carmichael, Jesse Jackson, James Meredith, Thurgood Marshall, W.E.B. Du Bois, and the list goes on. But on a day like today, when we honor the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., I feel it is important to also acknowledge his most powerful alter ego. It is fitting that the term alter ego can mean both a person's secondary or alternate personality and an intimate and trusted friend. The historical relationship between the two men thus belies the psychological, moral, and spiritual dimensions of their impact on my generation. The psychic balance I speak of between the two, in my own mind, amplifies the terrible symmetry of oppression. And that symmetry is written in the language of historical failure and missed opportunities. Before I dive deeper, I wish to illuminate the contours of those monumental failures and explain how they relate to hysteresis. You see, the problem is we talk of the eras, the era of Reconstruction, and the era of civil rights, as if they are past remnants of a challenging but resolved time. What era are we in now? The three strikes and you're out era, as so eloquently put by Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr.? The Reconstruction era, which lasted from December 8th, 1863 to March 31st, 1877, following the American Civil War, marked a significant chapter in the history of civil rights in the United States. According to SparkNotes, it encompassed three major initiatives: restoration of the Union, the transformation of Southern society, and the enactment of progressive legislation favoring the rights of freed slaves. And during that time, a series of progressive laws and amendments were passed in Congress that protected blacks' rights under federal and constitutional law. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment granted black citizenship. The 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. And the Civil Rights Act of 1875 banned racial discrimination in public places. During those years, African Americans enjoyed a period when they could actively participate in the political process. They could acquire the land of former owners, seek their own employment, and, importantly, own firearms. In response, Southern states passed black codes, which imposed voter qualifications and bolstered the sharecropping system. And that ensured that the standard of living did not change much for freed slaves. Later, a conservative Supreme Court effectively repealed the 14th and 15th Amendments, as well as the Civil Rights Act of 1875. By 1877, after only 14 years, Northerners were tired of Reconstruction. The routine violations of black civil rights were then ignored. The violence with which white America reimposed racial oppression after the Reconstruction era was matched when millions committed to an unwavering and often violent opposition to the civil rights movements of the 1960s. The Equal Justice Initiative organization rightly wrote in their Segregation in America documents that understanding this mass opposition to racial equality, integration, and civil rights is central to confronting the continuing challenges of racial inequality today. The initiative also describes in their Lynching in America documents that more than 4,400 racial lynchings occurred in the United States during the period between Reconstruction and World War II. And that works out to be an average of one lynching every 6 days for nearly 71 years. They describe how the systematic lynching of African Americans was part of a widely supported campaign of terrorism to enforce racial subjugation and segregation. Obviously, what I call the hysteresis in race relations in this country occurred because we never got it right. The moral imperative to correct slavery that resulted in Reconstruction and then the Civil Rights era both lasted very short time. America passed amendments to the Constitution, promised lands and mules, changed some laws about voting rights and discrimination, but not hearts and minds, and then said, "We're done." And that is why, in this era of third strike and you're out, I recently heard someone from a political cult say, "There's no such thing as racism. If an African American isn't able to succeed in this nation for the past 50 years, it's their own fault." That response to the ever-present racism in our country clearly demonstrates that what King fought so hard to eradicate is alive and well. And that road of non-violence and moral indignation he wanted us to take just about has brought us to the same place where we started 50 years ago. It is bitter irony that black people are now told that we are not protesting the murder of black people in the streets in our nation correctly. The disapproval that Martin Luther King Jr. would have had against violence is now invoked as the standard for good and appropriate behavior. So now let's take a look at King's counterbalance, the strikingly handsome but terrible Dark Knight, iconically photographed by Don Hogan Charles for Ebony magazine, peeking through his curtains with an M1 carbine in his hand. Here's a quick little bit of historical trivia. Did you know that King and X only met each other one time? On March 26, 1964, less than a year before X's death. Did you also know that in 1965, while King was jailed in Selma, Alabama, X traveled to Selma where he had a private meeting with Coretta Scott King? He said, "I didn't come to Selma to make his job difficult. I really did come thinking that I could make it easier. If the white people realize what the alternative is, perhaps they will be more willing to hear Dr. King. Isn't that fascinating? Malcolm X was keenly aware of his role as King's alter ego in the mind of a frightened American public over 50 years ago. After all, what is more terrifying than an armed, self-assured black nationalist who insists on holding government, religion, and corporations accountable for their treatment of African Americans? Well, hold on here. Let's flash forward 50 years. What is still more terrifying than an armed, self-assured black nationalist who insists on holding government, religion, and corporations accountable for their treatment of African Americans? If you, in all honesty, think the answer is nothing, then 1, you're absolutely right, 2, you're part of the problem, and 3, you've just acknowledged that nothing has significantly changed. In his brilliant 2020 book, entitled Begin Again, author Eddie S. Glaude, Jr. chronicled how James Baldwin, who knew both Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, was disillusioned by the fact that the civil rights movement failed to force America to confront its pernicious lies about race. In Begin Again, Glaude emerges as a powerful witness to Baldwin's searing commentary about the civil rights era through his own analysis of our uncomfortably parallel time. Glaude also provides a fascinating interpretation of how the Reconstruction, civil rights, and present eras are all related. James Baldwin insisted that he had not been part of the civil rights movement. He agreed with Malcolm X that if a person is a citizen, they shouldn't have to fight for their civil rights. In an interview for his 1964, in his interview in 1964 for his book Who Speaks for the Negro, Baldwin said the civil rights movement was definitely not a revolution, saying it is a very peculiar revolution because it has to have its aims the establishment of a union and a radical shift in the American mores, the American way of life, not only as it applies to the Negro, obviously, but as it applies to every citizen of the country. And then as late as 1979, he hammered the final nail in the coffin of the civil rights movement by calling it, quote, the latest slave rebellion. Typically, Baldwin was brutally right on. I will shamelessly use Baldwin now as the fulcrum point to find the balance between King and X. The scary firebrand that most associate with the image of Malcolm X actually changed many of his positions towards the end of his life. After his break from the Nation of Islam and his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964, he said that seeing Muslims of all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-eyed Africans, interacting as equals, led him to see Islam as a means by which racial problems could be overcome. He repudiated his stance on the separation of black people from white people, although he continued to advocate for self-determination for African American communities. He also stressed a more global perspective in the struggle for equal rights. For his part, by 1965, King began broadening his political and social landscape. His influence as a civil rights leader waned as he revealed a wider range of other issues such as open housing, opposition to the Vietnam War, and economic justice. His vision was increasingly more for revolution than for simple reform. He began to criticize systematic flaws of racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism, and asserted that reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be faced. Both men changed and broadened their visions over time. To most people in the United States, King was godly and safe, and Malcolm X was threatening and violent. King had a dream, and he was killed for it. And X had an awakening, and he was killed for that. Towards the end of his life, Martin Luther King said that white supremacy is the great barrier to democracy. On January 6th, 2021, we witnessed a mob of people incited to violence by our president to attack the very heart of our democracy. What motivated them to do this? Certainly, the president and his fellow power-craven partners were instigators. But the fundamental causes of the attack are the fear that privileged white Americans have enjoyed for so long is coming to an end. The government that betrayed that privilege is now the target of their fury. We live in two countries, two realities. On one hand, we must uphold the rights of all citizens to express their opinions, fear, anger, frustration, pain, prejudices, and yes, idiocy. On the other hand, we must guard against harm to others because of those expressions. We must choose whether to live in a democracy with an egalitarian, racially diverse, creative marketplace of competing ideas, or live in an authoritarian regime which stifles creativity and comforts conformity. Change happens slowly, but it must be balanced against the expediencies of the moment. The balance of forces is what both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. understood. Both men were correct in their assessment of the culture in which we live. And notice that I say that very consciously, because the culture they lived in is essentially the same one we live in today. It is a culture rotted from and hollowed out by racism that has yet to be fundamentally addressed. Malcolm and Martin offer a holistically balanced approach towards our present crisis. They admonish us to view our situation like the mythical Janus that looks both forward and backwards. Deliberate, decisive, and courageous action must arise from both an acknowledgement of our racist past and a vision of a racist-free future. Every day we delay puts us in deeper peril. What can you do? Challenge your friends and family to move beyond deer-eyed apathy to clear-eyed action. Inform yourself about the lives and work of great civil rights leaders for guidance in navigating these even more dangerous waters. As we saw after the storming of our nation's capital, there are great forces of violent hatred arrayed against the very notion of a liberal democracy. So, organize, commit, act with both king-like kindness and X-like purpose. We will see a better, more just world, but we can't just pray about it anymore. Namaste.
Thank you, Clovice, for your wonderful sermon. And now, let's take a moment of reflection and hear another song from Mo.
Hey Willie, Willie, come to the window. Hey Willie, Willie, look at what I see. He's riding into town on a swayback mule. Got a tall black hat and he looks like a fool, but he sure is talking like he's been to school. And it's 1853. Hey Willie, Willie, listen what he's saying. Hey Willie, Willie, he says it's getting late. And he says that all these colored folks should all be free to walk around the same as you and me. He's talking about a thing he calls democracy. And it's 1858. Hey Willie, Willie, hear the band a play. Hey Willie, Willie, you better get your gun, 'cause the boys are cheering and the men are too, and they're all putting on their coats of blue, and they say the country's future is up to you. And it's 1861. Hey Willie, Willie, now the fight is over. Hey Willie, Willie, you've come home alive, but your coat of blue is stained with red, and the man in the tall black hat is dead. We've got to remember every word he said. And it's 1865. Hey Willie, Willie, come to the window. Hey Willie, Willie, look at what's begun. I see race and creed and color walking side by side. They're walking down a column that's a century wide, but it's still along a bloody hard, a damned hard fight. And it's 2021.
That was great, Mo. So today we have a tale for all ages, Star Brothers, written by our beloved Clovice Lewis Jr.
A long time ago, in our same galaxy, but a very long way from here, there lived 5 brothers. They were all stars who had existed for many millions of years. If you look out into the dark sky at night, you can see them winking at us here on Earth. The brothers were very interested in what happens on our planet. In fact, they were so interested that when the oldest one, named Abraham, saw that African people were being used as slaves in the United States, he came down and lived as a human to do something about it. Over time, he was elected to be the president. But the people who thought they could own other human beings were so angry that Abraham was trying to stop them that they left the United States to start their own country. Now, those people having a temper tantrum were finally defeated, and the African Americans they had enslaved were freed. But the tantrum wasn't finished, and a man named Booth came up to Abraham one night and slapped him in the head so hard that Abraham had to leave his body and go back to being a star. The African Americans were freed, but they were still being treated very badly for many years. Finally, the brothers said, "Hey, we have to do something about this." So John agreed to go down to earth. He fought in a great war to free all people. He also became the President of the United States and said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." The people having a temper tantrum became worse. There was so much work to do that John asked his brothers Malcolm and then Martin and finally Bobby to help him free the African Americans again. But a man named Oswald came up and slapped John in his head so hard that John had to leave his body and go back to being a star. Malcolm, who became a powerful African American warrior, fought so hard for his people that he said, "If someone hits your cheek, hit them back so they remember to treat you with respect." Martin, who became an African American minister, said, "I have a dream for our nation that all people will be respected for their hearts." Bobby, who was born into John's earth family, said, "The purpose of life is to contribute in some way to making things better." All the Star Brothers freed a lot of people by inspiring and encouraging African Americans in their struggles and helping all people to be more loving and fair. But there are so many people who really hate other people, so they slapped all of the other brothers in turn and made them go back in their places in the night sky as stars. The angry people who like to slap everyone else thought they got rid of the brothers, but that's because they don't understand the power of love. The brothers are in the night sky, but a part of each of them are the stars in our American flag. So the brothers are always reminding us to love one another and treat everyone with dignity and respect. Remember the wonderful words each of them said? Well, now it's your turn to say your own words and tell the people who are angry all the time to just take a chill pill and peace out like the Star Brothers, Abraham, John, Malcolm, Martin, and Bobby. Tell them to go outside at night to remind them of how small they really are. The Star Brothers will always be winking at them.
I really enjoy listening to Clovice's writing. Just as Clovice has given us generously of his time and multiple talents, let us take a moment now to exercise that all-important generosity of spirit with an offering that supports the mission and service of UUCC. For the generosity you display by being present here, and the generosity of all of those who support this community with time, with talent, with treasure, with trust, we thank you all most profoundly. If your generous spirit does move you today, please feel free to contribute what you can to UUCC, either by check or online. Please follow the instructions in today's order of service. I'm also going to put some basic information in the chat window. But it's better than that. While collections take place, let us take a few moments to hear Mo Robinson sing Your Daughters and Your Sons.
Good morning. I'd like to repeat Malcolm X's statement at this point. You can't separate peace from freedom, because no one can be at peace unless he has his freedom. That quote takes us nicely into our next song. Entitled Your Daughters and Your Sons, it was written by Tommy Sands, a fellow countryman of mine. Tommy hails from County Down in Northern Ireland, and he's been writing and singing songs of social and political commentary for longer than he probably cares to remember. Pete Seeger described him as a richly talented singer and songwriter. Frank McCourt, author of Angela's Ashes, calls him the Bard of Peace. And Seamus Heaney, Ireland's Nobel Prize-winning poet, said of Tommy Sands, "You feel you can trust the singer as well as the song." So here comes the song. In it, Tommy writes about sowing the seeds of freedom and peace, not to mention justice and equality as well, underlining and supporting the point made by Malcolm X. We don't have Tommy here to sing it for us, but Pamela and I will give it our best shot. Your daughters and your sons. They wouldn't hear your music and they pulled your paintings down. They wouldn't read your writing and they banned you from the town. But they couldn't stop you dreaming, and a victory you've won. For you sowed the seeds of freedom in your daughters and your sons. In your daughters and your sons, your daughters and your sons. You sowed the seeds of freedom in your daughters and your sons.
Your weary smile, it proudly hides the chain marks on your hands, as you bravely strive to realize the rights of every man. And though your body's bent and low, a victory you've won, for you sowed the seeds of justice in your daughters and your sons.
In your daughters and your sons, your daughters and your sons, you sowed the seeds of justice in your daughters and your sons. Well, I don't know your religion, but one day I heard you pray for a world where everyone can work and all the children play. And though you never got your share of the fruits that you had won, you sowed the seeds of equality in your daughters and your sons. In your daughters and your sons, your daughters and your sons, you sowed the seeds of equality in your daughters and your sons.
They taunted you in Belfast, they tortured you in Spain, and in that Warsaw ghetto where they tied you up in chains, in Vietnam and Chile where they came with tanks and guns, it's there you sow the seeds of peace in your daughters and your sons.
In your daughters and your sons, your daughters and your sons, it's there you sow the seeds of peace in your daughters and your sons. And now your music's playing and the writing's on the wall, and all the dreams you painted can be seen by one and all. And now you've got them thinking and the future's just begun, for you sowed the seeds of freedom in your daughters and your sons. In your daughters and your sons, your daughters and your sons, you sowed the seeds of freedom in your daughters and your sons. In your daughters and your sons, your daughters and your sons, you sowed the seeds of freedom in your daughters and your sons.
We'll now extinguish the... Please join with me in reading these words by Elizabeth Sell Jones. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, or warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. And now, Shauna, please lead us in our closing hymn.
You all know this closing hymn. Whether you first heard it in 1945 when the tobacco laborers were striking, or in the great civil rights marches of the 1960s, or during many protests since then against war, injustice, and hatred, we will always have this song, and our souls will always draw sustenance from its words. So please rise in body and or spirit to join the other people of conscience who down through the decades have walked and marched and sung this great song of hope and solidarity. We shall overcome.
This was a wonderful and very timely service today. And Shauna, thank you for your time at UUCC. Thank you to Clovice for your inspirational words. We want to acknowledge our Third Sunday production team. And you know about Shauna. She's our pianist and music director. And we also saw Noreen Cooper-Hevlin, who's our artistic director for today's service, and our session management engineer, whom you didn't see, but he was doing everything with the slides and music and video, and there's a longer list. Anyway, his name is Rob Carey, and I want to acknowledge our singers, Linda Grace Frost, Tom Devine, Shauna, her own self, Becca Troxler-Don, David Lefcourt, Drew Wilson, Joanne Schreiner, Knuti Van Hoven, Lisa Shepard, Paul Davis, Peggy Rahman, Pete Zekel, and Sharon Davis. Thank all of you for participating in this timely service.